So how's everybody doing?
It's warmer than minus 39, I can tell you that.
Yes,
At least in Brookline.
It is balmy out there. Well,
Right.
Governor Dukakis, I don't know if you would actually appreciate the things that I was saying beforehand, because I was casting some aspersions on your fine city,
It's okay.
in terms of hardiness for bad weather.
Oh, yeah.
I was
Yeah, we don't.
suggesting that I'm Canadian, and I actually lived for a while in both Russia and Finland, and I was comparing the approaches to
Right.
bad weather, or inclement weather as they call it
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you had to call a few snow emergencies in your days.
Not too often. Not too
Wait,
often.
were you wait, let me see. What year was that? The legendary
The blizzard of 78.
78, right? So
78.
you were
Yeah,
governor for that.
I was. Closed the state down for a week.
Yeah, it must have
Interesting.
been interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, welcome to our class.
Good to be here.
It's really great to have you. Do you have your mug?
Beautiful mug. Thank you so much.
But are you drinking coffee out of it?
I'm not drinking. I'm not sure. I mean, it's so lovely that I'm not sure I want to.
No, you have to drink out of it. You have to drink out of it. This is I made a special delivery to Governor Dukakis' home yesterday to deliver the mug to give him the opportunity to drink out of it. But it's okay. It's okay.
I've got it here. Hold on a second.
It's okay. It's okay.
Hold on.
Look at me guilting the governor for not
Beautiful.
for not drinking out of his mug.
Beautiful, but I mean it's so lovely.
As I've been saying all semester, coffee is best drunk out of commemorative mugs. And by the way, there are a couple of people. I think Anna Yerksa, I see you, and Millie McChaney, wherever you are on here, that I owe you mugs. I have them here. And one of them, by the way, Anna, right? This is you? No, wait, this is you, right? The Delmont one?
The most recent one.
You're the most recent one. Okay, so well, that's this one, because this one we still have to do, right? So that's this one. And by the way, Governor Dukakis, this is a mug made for Matthew Delmont's class on integration and segregation in Boston, and the front has I have to move my head a bit to get the focus, but has a picture of Ellen Jackson and Mayor White at Freedom House. But you make a cameo in the back.
For heaven's sake.
My head.
I wonder when would that have been? Any idea?
It's the 70s. I don't know the exact date, but it's you, Paul Parks, and Ellen Jackson together. And I got these images from Northeastern's digital repository service.
Really?
So, I keep preaching it to you students for your final project, and I'll send you these projects, Governor. They're going to be incredible. They're making digital story maps relating to the history of Boston, but to use the resources in Northeastern's archives, digital archives, and digital repository services. Because they're really amazing. So first order of business is mug from last week. 1 second. I just realized that I left my paper. My paper with the winners. From last week. So the question for last week, that's this beautiful mug, which is Matthew Carroll on a sexual abuse scandal in the Boston Archdiocese. All copyrights approved right? So no copyright issues. Governor Dukakis, this particular mug was delayed. I was busted for copyright infringement, and the company canceled it on me, and I had to change the picture twice. So on the front is a picture of the Boston Globe's old headquarters on Morrissey Avenue in Dorchester, and on the back is the inside of Cathedral of the Holy Cross, walking distance from Northeastern. And the question was, in the movie Spotlight, the two scenes, or sorry, I shouldn't say the two scenes, the two locations in the, Jack suggested I shouldn't confess to copyright infringement to a governor, but, you know, his powers of law enforcement have ended, fortunately. So, so the two scenes, two locations in the film, inside the police station and all the offices inside the Boston Globe. Where were those filmed? And the answer, I've got Chrissy Benson, Hunter Rodriguez, Jake Jordan, and Jack Price getting this correct.
It was Toronto, right?
Toronto, yeah. You know, even if you didn't know and you couldn't find it looking up, it would be a reasonable guess if I was asking it. Yeah, the answer is Toronto, which is funny. A popular place to film, especially when the Canadian dollar is low. All right, so I've got an image. Chrissy Benson, what's your number?
13.
13. Hunter Rodriguez, what's your number?
76.
76. Jake Jordan, what's your number? Jake, are you here? Oh, Jake misses out on competing for a mug. Jack, what's your number? 60. All right, we've got 13, 76, and 60. Did I miss anybody, by the way, who sent me Toronto? No? All right. And I would have to say that somebody guessed last week. So Anna got it on the nose at 68 for Jaromir Jagr. But somebody guessed 66 too. Who guessed 66? I don't recall, but somebody guessed. Did you guess 66 because of Mario Lemieux?
No.
No? Okay, so I thought that people were on to me, and I chose Mario Lemieux first. At first, I'm like, you know, this was another star from my childhood, from Montreal, phenomenal player. And then I realized he's number 66, and I said, oh, somebody is starting to guess the pattern, so I got to get somebody nobody will guess. So the mug goes to Chrissy because it's number 9 for this guy. You guys would not know this guy, but from my childhood. I got to move my face so it can focus. His name is Lanny. Try saying. His name is Lanny McDonald, and he's number 9. What you really got to see is the mustache. There you go. That is a fantastic mustache. Lanny, Jonah, you know Lanny? None of you grew up in Calgary. So he actually played for Toronto when I was really young, but he played most of his career in Calgary. That's right, 1989 Stanley Cup champion. And this was in Canada, this was a huge Stanley Cup because it was Montreal against Calgary. And being from Toronto, even though my parents were Habs fans, as they say, Montreal fans, because they grew up in Montreal. You know, I was a Leafs fan, and I loved the Flames, and I loved Lanny McDonald. Lanny McDonald had competed against Gretzky. There was an Alberta rivalry for many years between Edmonton and Calgary, and Lanny competed with Gretzky, although Gretzky was a much better player. And by 89, he was really old. I don't know how old he was, but he was really old, and he didn't actually play that much. And he missed like 3 games, and they went to Game 7. And the coach was like, I can't keep Lanny out for Game 7. And he played, and he scored the winning goal. And it was just amazing. And he had the best mustache. So the number was number 9. Chrissy, you win it with number 13. Congratulations. And come pick up your mug. Same with you, Anna. Same with you, Millie. And can you guys show me your mugs? Who's got mugs? Hickory, you've got a mug. Who's showing me mugs? Daniel is showing his mug. That's a nice the American Revolution one. Cole is showing that beautiful Nancy Seashoals one. Hickory is showing the beautiful Mark Peterson, the Pine Tree Shilling. Gorgeous, I love it. And Noah is showing me his non-mug despite having had one. Okay, so today we've got a really, you want to know what? Jonah is impressing me with his hockey knowledge. That's right. Number 9 could be Maurice Richard, the Rocket Richard, who was, certainly an icon in Canada. The answer is because I grew up in Toronto. I mean, and although we did all have to read this piece of Canadiana called The Hockey Sweater, which is about, well, anyway, I will digress, so I won't go there. But anyway, we have a beautiful mug for today. Since this week on policing, we have 2 speakers, both talking about the challenges of policing in Boston. And so I split it in half. And this image is from the Digital Repository Service. So we have, again, I have to move my head so it focuses. We have a press conference with Governor Dukakis and Bill Bratton, while Governor Dukakis was governor. And on the back, which we'll keep the back for Professor Brunson, who's going to talk to us about police clergy partnerships in the city for policing. Okay, so without further ado, I bring you Governor Michael Dukakis. Governor Dukakis was the longest serving governor in Massachusetts history. He served for 3 terms. His first term was, I had it written down, but 75 to 79, right?
Right.
75 to 79, and then 83 to 91 for his second 2 terms. Like I said, the longest serving governor in Massachusetts history. During that time also, he was the Democratic candidate for president in 1988. And, we're really lucky in Northeastern. I mean, Governor Dukakis is really a model public servant and the kind of person who leaves public service for another kind of public service. And came to Northeastern, I think pretty much as soon as you left the governor's residence, right?
No governor's residence in Massachusetts. We live in our own house.
Governor's office.
There's no mansion.
I didn't know that. You know what? That's not the trivia question. I didn't. That's not the trivia question. But I could have asked that. I didn't even know that.
That's right. 4 states do not have a governor's mansion, and we're one of them.
Good for us. Good for us. You probably did. I mean, is that a good thing?
I think it's a good thing. I think it's a thing. I think politicians ought to live in their own houses and walk through their own neighborhoods. And I never had security or any of that kind of stuff, and did just fine.
Yeah.
But there was an effort made, Simon, under Governor Volpe, who preceded me and some other folks, to buy an estate in Dedham and turn it into a governor's mansion. But a bunch of us younger legislators said, hey, governors should live in their own house, live in their own neighborhoods. And
I know that
we killed it.
I think good for you. And honestly, you'd much rather live in Brookline than on that estate in Dedham. I think if it's the one that I'm thinking of anyway, the one where they have like weddings and things like that.
Right.
Big grounds with a house in the middle. I only know that from having to stand in the rain miserably with my children as my wife finished her turkey trot there a couple of times. The students have heard it before, I think. I won't go on my rant about turkey trots, but anyway, that the local one ends there. But yeah, I think that is a really good thing. And he went anyway. Governor Dukakis came to Northeastern, where he has until June, this
Right.
past June, taught as distinguished professor of political science in the classroom, giving students the opportunity to work firsthand with somebody with so much experience in public life. And during that time also published, including a book with Senator Paul Simon called "Why Go Into Politics?" Right?
That wasn't the exact title, but it's okay.
It's like I said, I had it written down, but
Yeah.
something along the lines of "Why Go Into Politics?" Right?
Yeah.
What is the exact title? Do you remember? Or
I'm embarrassed to say I don't remember the title of my own book.
this happens.
Basically,
I know.
it was an effort to encourage young people to go into politics.
Yeah. So really, and it's wonderful, really wonderful to have him here to talk about something that was really important in his career, really important in his governorship, and his presidential candidacy, and still remains important, which is the challenge of policing in a big city and a populous and diverse state. And I'll have to say, if you can't get more timely than this. I don't know if you saw this morning, Governor Dukakis in the Boston Globe, but this is from this morning. State plan tightens oversight of police. Commission would wield key powers. Officers could lose some legal protections. So this is on after I think 4 months of negotiations on about what new regulations would be on the police. They finally came to an agreement. And that's coming from the state, and on the in the metro section too, on Marty Walsh, Mayor Vow's police reforms, and how Marty Walsh has really changed tack pretty dramatically since the summer in terms of his approach on the police. So it couldn't be any more timely than this. And students, I'll put these articles on Canvas for you. So. Governor Dukakis, I thought a nice place to start would be, since you have so much knowledge of the history of policing and the challenge of policing in Boston and in Massachusetts, to lay it out for us a bit. Why you think this is such an important topic, and what you think the trends have been in sort of the history of policing in the state.
Okay, let me try to keep this brief, Simon.
You don't need to.
That's all right. And the history of policing in Boston, especially in the 20th century, is an interesting one because we had a police strike in Boston in 1920, and the Boston police went on strike, and they were all fired and never returned. It's an interesting part of policing history in this city.
Yeah. And doesn't Boston claim to be the first police department in the country?
I'm not sure it was the first one, but it was early on. But It's very interesting that the governor at the time was a fellow named Calvin Coolidge.
Uh-huh.
And largely on the basis of how he handled that police strike, he got the Republican nominee for vice president and was in fact elected vice president 1920, and then succeeded to the presidency when the incumbent president died, and then of course was elected in 1924 for a second term. And he was an interesting guy. I don't know how many of you have studied anything about Coolidge. He was actually a Vermonter who moved from Vermont to Northampton and then was elected to the legislature from Northampton and became the president of the Senate. Was actually, he has a reputation for being a very stodgy kind of conservative guy, actually quite progressive when he was Senate president, and almost single-handedly settled a very, very rough textile strike in Lawrence during the IWW days, the National Workers of the World days, and forced the mill owners to pay an extra 25 cents an hour to their workers to settle that strike. That was Calvin Coolidge, who was supposed to be, kind of a conservative icon. He wasn't. In 1916, he ran for lieutenant governor and, among other things, strongly supported universal health insurance for the people of Massachusetts as a candidate. And then, and in those days, governors were elected every single year, and then went on to become governor and strongly supported universal health insurance, which at the time was not that radical because Theodore Roosevelt, in running in 1912, himself proposed universal health insurance. So we've been debating this issue, folks, since 1912. And Calvin Coolidge, who's thought to be a very conservative guy, supported universal health insurance paid for by employers when he ran for lieutenant governor in 2016.
It's interesting that Romney, when he was governor of Massachusetts, he didn't call it the Coolidge Plan.
Didn't call it the Coolidge Plan. No. It was interesting, but I love telling people, hey, Calvin Coolidge was for this years ago. Why are we so, why don't we get going on this thing? We've been kicking it around for decades. And, but he was not able to get it through. I don't know how hard he worked on it. And then, of course, he went off to become vice president in 1920 and succeeded, who was it, Harding, I guess, in when he died. So it's kind of interesting history. Anyway, so we had a police strike. Every one of those police officers lost his job and never returned to the police force. Whole new police department. Anyway, a fairly traditional kind of police department until the 1970s, when a whole new generation of younger police officers arrived on the scene. Bill Bratton, who we'll talk about, was one of them, but he wasn't the only one. Many of them came out of police families. They were fairly traditional in terms of their ethnicity and their backgrounds and so on and so forth. But for the first time, police officers in Massachusetts and in the city of Boston began going to institutions of higher education. Northeastern was one of them, and was one of the first universities in the country to offer a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, tailored not exclusively, but primarily to those who wanted to go into policing as a career. That was a radical step at the time. The notion that you'd want to go to college and maybe have to go to college in order to become a police officer. So there was that part of Boston history, which was kind of interesting and different. And at the same time, we were facing, particularly in the 70s, real issues with race, with ethnicity, with all this kind of stuff. And we began having serious demonstrations, agitation, protests, largely, though not exclusively, in the minority community. And all of this combined to produce a kind of new cop. Still historically, ethnically, pretty much like their fathers and grandfathers, but they went on to college. They got degrees. And many of them, Bratton was one of them. We'll talk about him, but not just Bratton. Really became first-rate police commanders. I was virtually at a retirement party last night for a guy named Bud Riley, who just retired after 25 years as the Harvard University police chief. But before that, he was not only a high-ranking state police officer, but the president of the state police union. Kind of interesting, isn't it? And a reformer, somebody that I happen to be quite close to, who was not a Boston guy, came from Lynn actually, and was a state police trooper, and state police became ultimately a lieutenant colonel in the state police, but then went over to Harvard and has just completed 25 years as the really extraordinarily able police chief at Harvard. There's a reason we haven't heard much about Simon problems with policing over there in Cambridge. And it has a lot to do with Bud Riley, who was, again, one of these part of this new generation of police officers and commanders who arrived on the scene in the 70s. I think it was in 71 that, well, I'm not quite sure. Maybe it was a little later than that, but not by much. I mean, Bud's been around for a long time, and an example of the kind of younger police officer and commander that we were able to attract. And community policing was very much a part of their approach. Nobody really, maybe one of you guys someday will do the definitive work on this, but nobody has really taken a good look at what has happened to policing in Massachusetts and more specifically in Boston. And you've probably, none of you know this because nobody mentions it for reasons I don't understand. Massachusetts has the lowest homicide rate in America. Is that a new piece of news for you guys? I suspect so. Has anybody ever told you that? No. Why
When
not?
Governor Dukakis told me that over the phone a few months ago, that was the first that I'd heard it.
Yeah. Now, why we're
Had
not
anybody
saying
else
that?
heard that?
Anyone else? I don't think so. We don't have the death penalty. We're supposedly a liberal state, and we have the lowest homicide rate in America. Think about it. Think about it. And there's a story there that maybe one of you guys will write about. I don't know, but it's well worth looking at. How is it that Massachusetts as a state and Boston as a city is one of the safest from a violence standpoint in the country? And it'd be well worth exploring what's happened here this way. I mean, we're not that different, are we, from other parts of the country? And yet, we're the safest state in the country.
So
Now, I did a lousy job of dealing with the death penalty issue when I ran for the presidency. Shame on me. But the fact of the matter is that what I should have said to George H.W. Bush was, hey, look, I come from Boston, you come from Houston. Your homicide rate is 6 times the Boston homicide rate, which was the case when I ran in 1988. Never said that, should have, but I had kind of decided I wasn't going to respond to his attack campaign. Turns out that was not the smartest thing to do. In any event, so Boston, while it's had its issues, including issues when it comes to policing, has had a remarkable record of relative safety, stability, and what I would call a modern progressive approach to policing, which doesn't mean getting rid of the police, which I think is nuts. I mean, we had 7 homicides over the 4th of July weekend in Boston, which is very unusual for us. How come? Well, it's a question you might think about. Over a 3-day period, 7 homicides. It's very unusual for this city. But overall, I think it's fair to say that the history of policing in Boston, starting back at least the late teens, 1920, the police strike and so forth, and coming down to the present time, has featured some interesting developments. Very active group of African American clergy who in the 70s were deeply and actively involved in trying to build bridges between the minority community and the police. And today, as I'm sure you know, probably know, we now have an African American police commissioner, who is again part of that tradition. But it is interesting, I think, Simon, that when I say to people, Boston's got the lowest homicide rate. When I talk to Massachusetts people, and I say Massachusetts got the lowest homicide rate in America, and Boston's the safest state, it's news to them. And
Yeah,
I don't know why. I don't know why we don't spend more time not only saying that, but trying to determine what's created it.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. And I would actually, so you mentioned community policing, right? And clearly that's been effective. How would you, this is a term that we hear a lot, right?
Right.
And so how do you see that as working? What do you see that when you use the term community policing, and a lot of these reforms came in, while you were governor, right? What did you?
Many of them generated at the municipal level.
Right. So how did you see that? I mean, what did you, how do you continue to see that? What does community policing,
It's a good question. And you guys have had some readings on this, including one authored by Bratton himself, who was one of the leading proponents of this. And he talks a lot about a system of mutual respect. Mutual respect. What is that? Police who respect the public and the public who respects the police. And they work together to develop that sense of respect, mutual respect. The active involvement of members of the community in policing, with the police, and vice versa. And it certainly has made a difference, not only here, but across the country. On the other hand, as we've seen these past several months, there are an awful lot of places in the United States that are having difficulty working on mutual respect between police and their citizens. And it's something that we've got to continue to work at. But I think it's fair to say that it has made a huge difference in that relationship here. And by the way, after he left Boston, he went to New York, as many of you know, or I think some of you know, and was recruited to come down and run the police department by a fellow named Rudy Giuliani, who's been in the news lately. Not in a very favorable light. And I can't understand what Giuliani is doing these days with this, with Trump and the election. I mean, it's the whole thing is a little nuts. But Bratton went down to New York, upset a lot of us who were big Bratton fans, because he had finally become commissioner in Boston, which he called his dream job. So why was he leaving after a year or two and going to New York? But he had an interesting response to that. He said, if I can demonstrate that what I'm advocating works, it will revolutionize policing in the United States. And at least to some significant extent, that has happened. Bratton went down to New York and cut where, by the way, they had 2,500 homicides every year. There almost wasn't a day when there wasn't another murder someplace. He cut the homicide rate in half in 2 years. Think about it. And then Giuliani fired him. Why would you do that? Simon, I used to have a fun with my students when we discussed this when I was teaching, and I'd say, why would you do that? And we'd have a discussion for about a half an hour, and then I'd kind of quietly say, well, you got to understand, Giuliani is nuts.
So you're skipping right to the end.
Yeah. No, we discussed it for a half an hour, and I said, you got to understand. Anyway, went off to Los Angeles, where I teach in the wintertime at UCLA. So I had an opportunity to see him working at first, firsthand right there. And same approach. He was there for 7.5 years, revolutionized policing and the police community relationship in Los Angeles, which was very bad when he arrived, and has improved enormously, largely thanks to his leadership and the leadership of those who have succeeded him. Same basic approach, mutual respect.
What did that look? What did that look like on a policy level, though? Like, how was that? How was that implemented?
Involving community groups very actively with the police. It had always been a kind of standoff relationship. In fact, cops in Los Angeles before Bratton arrived were rotated every year, a year and a half, so they wouldn't be corrupted. Think about it. And Bratton said, wait a second. I mean, if we're going to develop good, solid police community relations, then these police officers have to remain in neighborhoods.
The idea,
and become very much a part of that.
The idea behind that was that there was a perception that if they were entrenched in the communities, then they would be susceptible to
corruption.
To corruption.
Yeah.
Huh.
And Bratton's attitude was, look, you not only want close police community relations, but you want your best community police officers to remain in those neighborhoods, to be promoted because of their effectiveness in those neighborhoods. And if you're concerned about police corruption, then deal with police corruption. Don't deal with it by rotating cops in and out of neighborhoods, every year and a half, to try to avoid that.
On the more controversial side, though, for some of the materials, the articles that Bratton wrote that the students read, and in an interview he did for City Journal as well. I mean, he talks a lot about disorder, about the relationship between disorder and violent crime, and he suggests that violent crime essentially follows disorder, and that the communities themselves want order because that most of the calls to 311 and 911 in the United States are what he calls quality of life calls, public urination and graffiti and
boom boxes at 3 a.m. and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, and he's right.
And so people want that. They want order. And he's in this interview he did very recently, just a couple of months ago, he's extremely critical of within New York of city council's efforts to, I guess, roll back some of these enforcement on these public order laws or one thing he talks about is the decriminalization of public urination, being a very bad thing, or not having penalties for graffiti. I can see both sides on this, but critics definitely suggest that some of these policies, lead to surveillance of minority communities, that are over policing, and might explain the difference in the incarceration and arrest rates and so on. I'm wondering, what do you think about that? I mean, I can see both sides to this argument.
Well, I'm a fan of the Bratton approach, and I don't mean every once in a while somebody will accuse Bratton of being the stop and frisk guy. That's absolutely false. Bratton never supported that kind of stuff. But he talks about this culture of mutual respect. police respecting the community respecting the police, which means close working relationships between citizens and their police, close community relations and close relationships, involving citizens actively as in an advisory capacity to police at the local level. One of the things he did, of course, he didn't last long because Giuliani fired him, but I think there are 75 police precincts in New York City. They're the administrative unit. They have 100,000 people. They're a small city. He wanted precinct commanders who were his best to take those jobs. That it was so important that his first team be made up of excellent commanders who believed deeply in good community relations with their citizens and practiced it. And I think I can't tell you what's happening these days, but certainly when Bratton was there before he got fired, and then when he went out to Los Angeles, those precinct or district commanders were a key to a lot of his success and his approach to policing. But they all were strongly committed to this very important relationship between the police and the people that they were responsible for.
And I imagine it was the case in Boston as well. I mean, one thing that I thought was interesting in this interview that he did is he really starts by talking about the challenges that he faced in Boston as commissioner in the 1970s. The major challenge being the segregation of the city. And I mean, this is an issue that's come up over and over in our class. But he says, you know, and he actually doesn't fall back on sort of tropes about busting. He says, you know, the public school system and public housing in Boston until the 1980s were among the most segregated in the country.
Right.
And that Boston is still one of the most segregated cities in the country, and sort of immediately acknowledges the challenges that presents from a policing perspective.
Right. Now, that is changing. Obviously, the city is becoming more integrated in many ways and more diverse and
more diverse. I wonder how much more integrated, but that's a different.
Well, substantially more, Simon. I mean, this was look, I grew up in Brookline. Brookline is what, 3 miles from downtown Boston, right?
Yeah.
African Americans could not live in Brookline, Massachusetts when I was a kid.
Yeah.
There were 3 black families in Brookline. 2 of them were janitors, whose kids, by the way, went to work for me as professionals when I was governor. And the third was a world-renowned tenter who somehow found somebody up in Pill Hill to sell him a house. That was it. That was it.
But we're still living with that legacy, though, aren't we? I mean,
no,
you know,
not these days. This is a much more integrated community. I mean, Brookline's a much more integrated community than it was.
It is, but there's still a lack of affordable housing.
Well,
they still
that
have
is
control
true.
of their own public school system.
That's true.
There's still barriers to entry.
That is true, and one of the things that Massachusetts has got to do is get even more aggressive when it comes to affordable housing.
Yeah,
I think everybody knows that. People are talking about it, obviously trying to do something about it. And one of the interesting questions is how do you integrate a town like Brookline, which is these days very expensive? I mean, I'm sitting
you
in the
annex
kitchen.
it. You won't like my answer, but I say you annex.
No, I mean, look, you know, the cost of housing in the Boston area is off the wall these days, and I'm sure all of you know this.
Talking about police, you know, I live in West Roxbury, as the the students are already nauseated from hearing every week about one day they're actually going to go out to West Roxbury and they say, "This is it." It's just, but this, of course, this is the neighborhood where the police officers predominantly live. But it's a real issue. Among the younger ones coming up, I've heard friends talking about that. People can't afford to buy in West Roxbury anymore, and even and then it was Hyde Park was a little bit more reasonable, but the police still has a residency requirement, but there's nowhere for them to live.
Yeah. No, it's serious,
it's
and it's a state problem that has to be dealt with as a state priority. No question about it.
So I want to bring the students in, but before I do, I have to ask you about 1988, and because these students, I mean, it's amazing. These students were actually this was before they were born. All of these.
That's right. That's right.
And so it's for me, it's present. It's not history, but for them, it's ancient history. So I would love to hear you tell them a little bit about what happened in the election from your standpoint, and how the whole issue of race and crime became weaponized as a political issue. And especially because it seemed this past summer and fall that there was a possibility that the presidential race could play out in a similar way, right? And that there were resonances. So
look, the issue of race is with us, and we've got to confront it and deal with it. But I should have won that race in '88, no question about it. And I made two big mistakes. First, I decided I would not respond to the Bush attack campaign.
Could you tell them a little bit about about Willie Horton and
I mean, there were. I was attacked by Bush. Race was part of it, a variety of other things. And I remember, Simon, early in the campaign, I was talking to Mario Cuomo, who I thought was one of the finest people I'd ever met in public life. Really, just a very special guy, who said to me, I wouldn't pay any attention, he said, to the Bush attacks. You just keep it positive. People are tired of that stuff. And 4 days before the election, we were campaigning together in Queens, and he turned to me, he said, "That's the worst advice I ever gave anybody." I said, "Look, it wasn't your fault. I mean, I agreed with you. Both of us were positive people. We worked very hard as governors, so thought we had done some pretty good things, and it was just one of those things. You cannot, in this day and age, not respond effectively to these kinds of attack campaigns. And I saw, Simon, the other day, one of the most, what I think, we'll see what happens, one of the most effective responses to this attack stuff, which is going on in Georgia every day. I mean, those Georgia candidates have almost done nothing positive. It's just attack, attack, attack. And the minister who's running for the Senate does this one, I thought, wonderful spot where he basically talks about why are they doing this in a kind of casual way with a little bit of humor.
With his dog? Is it the one where he's walking the dog?
With his dog, right. And so that there's humor there, there's humanity there, but he makes the point. As I say to people these days, if you're the subject of an attack campaign, take it seriously and try to turn it into a character issue on the guy that's doing it, which is precisely what he's doing with plenty of humor. So not responding to the attack campaign was a mistake. And secondly, I'm a guy that believes deeply in precinct-based grassroots organization. And when I began thinking about running for the presidency and went out talking to people and asking, for their advice and what do they think and so on and so forth, virtually all of them said, well, door-to-door precinct-based organization may be okay if you're running for city council, but not for the presidency. It was Barack Obama who proved pretty decisively that that was lousy advice, and unfortunately, I took it.
Can you tell them though about specifically on let's say the Willie Horton ad and the sort of nature of the use of fears about race and crime in the campaign?
Well, it was pretty obvious what was going on. I mean, he was this black guy who had been out on furlough and had allegedly raped a white woman, so on and so forth, which, is, you don't have to be brilliant to figure out what that's all about. And I really didn't respond to that as I should have. I just kind of let it go. It's a mistake. You can't let
And you
it
would have
go.
responded with your record, right? With
Well, not so much, not only the record, but basically saying to Bush one, hey, look, I'm from Boston. You're from Houston. You've got the death penalty. It was all about the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have the death penalty. Your homicide rate is 6 times ours. Why didn't I do that? Well, because I decided I wasn't going to respond to the attack campaign. It was a mistake. It's a mistake. You have to. You can't let that stuff go.
Only because of hindsight. There's no way one can't predict the future or how the public is going to respond to these things.
I would say if somebody comes to me and says, how do you deal with attack campaigns? I say you deal with them, and if possible, turn them into a character issue on the guy that's doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it is remarkable that clearly, there was an effort over the summer by one party to do something similar again, to paint a candidate as soft on crime,
right.
As not supportive of the police, as equating that person with disorder, and
It's a recurrent
interestingly,
thing.
it didn't work, right?
Well,
there were other things going on. Maybe it would have if not for COVID.
It worked in some communities, obviously.
Yeah.
And some people took it seriously, but
yeah.
I thought on the whole, Biden did a pretty good job of dealing with it.
Yeah. So let me turn to the students. There are a couple of questions in the chat. The first one by Tess was about whether essentially how distinct Boston was. Were there other, in this transition to community policing in the 70s and 80s, and I guess the 90s as well, how distinct was Boston, or was this a sort of a nationwide trend?
Quite distinct, I think. It's not that other communities, other states were not moving in that direction, but Boston did so, I think, much more actively than most other cities. And Massachusetts, frankly, adopted that as well. Now, why Massachusetts? Well, Northeastern played a major role in this. There's no question that Northeastern University's commitment to a criminal justice major, which was unheard of at the time, and active involvement, and faculty who were skilled and experienced at this played a major role. And I think Northeastern deserves great credit. Now, of course, there are criminal justice programs in many colleges and universities around the country, but not then. This was a very, very unusual thing, and my hat's off to Northeastern for moving in that direction. And many of the young, impressive police commanders that were developed in Massachusetts, not just in Boston, but in policing generally in the state, came out of the Northeastern program.
Maybe we shouldn't be surprised that in Boston, a city so focused on higher education, that a sort of education-based approach to a problem is maybe particular to this city that's so focused on higher education.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, but I must say that I think Northeastern deserves a lot of credit for this because they
I'm
were.
all for giving more Northeastern credit.
But
And I think one of the things that the students have seen, over the semester, because I brought in so many people associated with the university, is just, the incredible people who are working here.
Yeah.
And from all over. Last week we spoke with Matt Carroll, who was a Boston Globe reporter, and
Right.
now is in the class.
Faculty. Yeah.
So there's a question about the sort of tradition of governors within Massachusetts having successful and popular governors from both parties. That's from Jack. But since we're still on the criminal justice question, I'm going to put that one on hold and go to Jonas. And by the way, students, if you want to speak directly to Governor Dukakis, just put in the chat RTS, meaning request to speak, and I'll just call on you. But Jonah asks, what's your view on the criminal justice reform legislation that's been passed since 1990, and whether you think that this has created meaningful change in communities? So I think he's talking about on the federal level.
I don't think it's not that I don't think legislative change may be necessary, but what's been going on at its best in the police field has a lot more to do with attitude, approach, relationships than it has to do with hard legislation. Yes, it was very much a part of a reform movement, if you will, in policing. But so much of it has to do with training, with practice, with bringing the community into the process, along with the police, attitude. Keep coming back to it. This approach, this attitude of mutual respect between communities and the police. A lot of that can't be legislated, but it does require leadership, effective leadership. And I can't begin to tell you just how that relationship has changed and evolved and strengthened in Massachusetts, because I've seen it repeatedly. This little retirement party that I talked about when we started with Bud Riley, the now retiring Harvard police chief, highly respected, believes in this police community relationship, practice it effectively and well. And he was one of these pioneers, if you will, in policing that became police officers in the early 70s and was just finishing up 50 years of this. He was a kid from Lynn, working class Lynn. And
this may actually, sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. And how is it that those folks developed? Well, some of it had to do with I think academic approaches and that kind of thing. A lot of it had to do with work that people in the police field did in this state. And this is not an attitude that's limited to Boston, let me tell you. I mean, it really permeates policing generally. And again, has a lot to do, in my judgment, with what Northeastern did, and then other schools in the area adopted their own programs.
This may actually also tie into another question by Jack in the chat, where he asks essentially why Massachusetts had successful and popular governors from both parties. That there is politics is maybe a little bit less. I don't know if partisan is the right word, but there's a greater tradition of bipartisanship, especially around these issues. If you look at it's pretty clear that Bratton, as an example, is a conservative. but of course worked very well with you. I don't know what what other people's politics were, but it seems that for a long time, the question of policing and police reform within Massachusetts was not a partisan issue, right? And because there has been a tradition here of successful and effective Republican and Democratic governors, right?
Yes, but to go back to Bratton, when you say, well, he's a conservative, I don't consider Bratton a conservative. I mean, at the time he was advocating this approach, he was considered, I'm not sure he's considered a radical, but he was certainly considered a guy that was talking about very different approaches to policing. And I think most of us would say, certainly for the time, enlightened ones and progressive ones. And nobody, I don't know of anyone who thought that Bratton was a conservative guy in kind of the traditional sense at all. He was a change agent, no question about it, both here and on the West Coast. But what he was proposing was very different from what we had. And when he went out to Los Angeles, one of the first groups he wanted to meet with was the Southern California Civil Liberties Union. What?
That's not generally a police perspective.
A police commander, that's, I mean, within a matter of a week or two, he was meeting with the board of the Civil Liberties Union in Southern California. Pretty different, different. So Jack, in that sense, he was I don't know where you put him on the ideological
scale. I mean, we could talk about that after, and I'll put Bratton on hold for a second. His opinions, I think, may have changed over time. They may have shifted over time as things around him change. But I don't know. We can, you would know. I defer to you. Well, the individuals and the politics much better than I do. But I want to give Jack a chance because he was he requests to ask a question in the chat directly.
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can.
All right, perfect. First of all, thank you for coming to talk to us.
Jack, tell me a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? Where's home?
I'm from Sharon, which is, I'm sure you're familiar with the area. So about 30 minutes south from here. I was curious about police accountability and your views on that, and whether you think things like body cams and oversight committees are necessary, especially in a modern day police force, or do you think that it hinders the department from officers doing their job, or something in between? I was just curious because that's been a hot button issue, especially with videos being released of police brutality and things like that. What your view was on?
I think in some ways it's unfortunate that we got to have video to tell people what's going on. But I mean, the fact of the matter is that the police, like any other public servants, have got to be accountable for their behavior. And I don't think this defunding the police doesn't make any sense to me. You need a police force, and a good one, and a responsible one.
To defend the defund the police people, aren't they really talking about shifting resources, though?
I'm not sure what they're talking about. All I can tell you is that you need a well-trained, well-equipped, responsible, responsive police force that works effectively and well with its citizens.
Yeah, and one of the things that Bratton says is that that's something that is wanted in minority communities. That's his claim.
No question. And wanted by good police officers. They want the same thing. If you talk to young police officers these days who've been trained in this new approach, they're very, very responsive. They believe that they should be held accountable. On the other hand, they also know that policing these days is not easy. Lots of mental health problems out there, lots of behavioral problems. It's not easy to be a good police officer, but that's what we ought to be training people to do. And these days, I think more and more and more police officers have that kind of training and are responsive. I see it even in my own town. I mean, it's just a whole different approach to how you deal with people.
Yeah, that actually relates to a question that Tyler asked in the chat about whether all of these decades of reform essentially paid dividends in this summer and at the current moment in terms of how the police in Boston responded. I assume, Tyler, you're talking about to protests, et cetera, especially in the Black and Latino community.
Well, what do you folks think? I mean, why?
Tyler, what do you think? Are you there?
Tyler, you with us? Boston was a relatively peaceful community this summer. I don't think that was an accident. I think it had a lot to do with training, with practice, with attitude on both sides, by the way.
Yeah.
And I was very proud of that, to tell you the truth. And again, not just in the city of Boston, but how about Chelsea? How about Lawrence? How about other communities that are?
Yeah, around Boston, there are a large number of majority communities.
No question, no question. And on the
That's a
whole,
great point.
that relationship, you take a city like Chelsea, that relationship is on the whole a good one.
That's an excellent point. So I actually, Noah is asking a question in the chat that is sort of similar to the one that I asked about what it means to abolish the police. It's a bit of a long question, so I would love Noah to ask it directly, if he doesn't mind. Noah, are you there? Do you have access to? You have access to microphone. Great. So do you want to ask it yourself?
Oh, go ahead.
Sure. You can hear me?
Yep.
All right. So you already said that we're not in favor of abolishing the police, but a common, a similar argument along the same lines is just to defund it, because a common criticism of the police is that, police forces such as the NYPD are just too large and over militarized. They don't look like police forces that are supposed to be engaging thoughtfully with the community. They look like a military. So do you think, a police force is due for change in that regard, of just kind of like Professor Rabinovich said, shifting resources, making it a little smaller so it can engage with the community better?
I don't think it's a matter of size. I mean, maybe it is in some cases, Noah, but I think it's a matter of attitude, training, approach. Trying to think of when Bill Clinton was president. There was a story in the New York Times about an African-American police officer in New York who seemed to be very effective doing what he was doing in his neighborhood. And he had grown up in that neighborhood. And Clinton's one of these guys that reads the New York Times. So he invited the guy.
What do you mean, the failing New York Times? Sorry.
The failing New York Times, yeah. It's never done better. Sorry,
I couldn't resist.
Trump's the best thing that ever happened to the New York Times and the Washington Post and a few other places. In any event, Clinton invited him to come, and I don't know whether he sat with Hillary but he was there and was introduced. And he was a black kid from New York who decided he wanted to be a police officer, and apparently was one of the most effective folks on the force. And I don't know whether he moved up and took on major command responsibilities and so forth, which, by the way, is an important part as well, Noah. That is, do you reward good young police officers by encouraging them to move up, so that an excellent community police officer then becomes a supervising sergeant and then a lieutenant and then has much greater impact on the department, because he or she, for that matter, takes on more and more command responsibilities, and the promotional system in New York, not just in New York, but in policing generally for years, was heavily kind of exam oriented and that kind of stuff, instead of rewarding community police officers with greater and greater command responsibilities, which is an important part of doing this. So it's not so much, it seems to me, it's the money, the this, the that, and so forth. It's how you approach policing in a general way, and do you, to repeat, reward good performance with greater and greater responsibility. And for a long time, that's not been the way things have worked in policing. It should.
That's a great point. And I think actually a lot of the resistance, though, has been from the departments like the exam system, right? And unions have fought against moving away from exams. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They seem to have, but it's anybody who knows anything about policing knows that a written exam is not the only way you test.
One would think, unless you're seeking, I hate to say this, but unless you're seeking
greater responsibility.
Sorry, I agree, but unless you're seeking to promote particular kinds of people, and I think that might be what the issue
that may be part of the problem.
Yeah.
But what we ought to be looking for is young police officers who have these qualities.
Yeah.
And are the kind of people that you should want to promote and ultimately become precinct commanders and supervising police and sharing their. I mean, for a long time, for example, I don't know whether this is the case in New York City, but for a long time, the goal of most police officers was to get out of the bag. That's the uniform, and become detectives.
Yeah.
Well, it's not that we don't need good detectives, but if you've got somebody like this particular guy that Clinton brought to his State of the Union address, you got somebody with those kinds of qualities. You don't want him to become a detective. You want him to become a commander. You want him to take on greater and greater responsibility and share his abilities and his approach to policing with other younger police officers coming along. And for a long time, I don't know what the situation is in New York these days, but for a long time, these folks wanted to get out of the uniform and be detectives. Nothing wrong with being a detective, but not when you have those kinds of qualities. You want those folks to remain in and move up in policing itself in the street and in the community.
Man, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
I want to turn to Sarah. Sarah, since I actually see you here, do you mind asking a question directly?
Sure. So given the fact that legislation was just agreed upon kind of last night or this morning for the police reform, there's the legislation created kind of like an independent commission to improve the transparency of police action and just kind of make a more thorough process. I'm not sure of all of the details, but I guess my question is this legislation, in your opinion, going to be effective in continuing to promote police activity within communities and creating that kind of community relationship, or is it ultimately going to hinder police effectiveness?
Well, we'll see. We'll see. It's not that I'm skeptical, but so much of this involves attitude, approach, relationships. We'll see. We'll see. I think done right, it can be helpful. But
in that case, then what is your kind of thought on done right? Like, what do you like? If you were a legislator or involved in this process, what would you kind of advocate for in terms of police reform then?
Well, the kind of approach the kind of approach that we've been talking about, which has to involve excellent training, and the kind of continuing accountability which emphasizes those qualities that are so important to this police community relationship. Now, some of that you can do, I think, with legislation and those kinds of things, but a lot of this has to do with training, with approach, with attitude, and that's the kind of thing that I would try to emphasize. I mean, I don't know how much of this is going on in Boston these days. I think it still is, but I hope it is. But most of the Boston police districts that I'm familiar with have community police
Liaisons.
how can I? Well, it's more than liaisons. They meet with representative citizen activists and active people in the community on a regular basis. That never happened in the old days. What?
It's funny, my kids absolutely love the annual, although I don't think they did it this past year due to circumstances, COVID, but they have an annual fishing derby in Jamaica Pond.
With the cops?
Yeah, it's the police. Yeah. They organize this annual fishing derby. And I have to say, talking about segregation and integration in the city, partly has to do, where Jamaica Plain is. And I've talked to this about students before that, even Jamaica Plain, which we see as an integrated neighborhood, isn't really. It has different sections within it. But, I was really, we did this a couple of years, just going down to Jamaica Pond and the kids they don't have to have licenses. They get to fish, they get gear, they get stickers, everything. But it's really one of the few sort of integrated moments I've witnessed within the city, both among the police and the people who are out there doing the fishing. It's really a great event, and really, I think
Simon, ideally in every police district in the city, there should be an ongoing community-based advisory group, if you will, that meets on a regular basis with the police and vice versa, and that relationship is close and effective and constructive and works.
Yeah.
And
there's a great question by Viraj.
That's part of this.
There's a great question by Viraj here that I want to ask, which is, it's a challenging question, but essentially, if young police officers agree with the sort of question of accountability, what does one do about potentially older generations of police officers who don't agree with the idea of accountability and who have a different view on what training should look like and what the role of police officers should be?
Well, it's a good question. We've been doing this now for quite a while. So even the veteran police officers are graduates of this newer approach to policing, and it's not an age thing. I mean, I see it all the time. I mean, I'm just in casual conversations, this, that, and the other thing. Much more sensitivity, and just an approach on the part of police these days, young and old alike. Because remember, we're talking about, I mean, Bud Riley, the guy that we retired yesterday, who's done such a great job over at Harvard and the state police, and was the head of the state police union, even while he became a lieutenant colonel in the state police. He's now 75. A great community police officer. Believes deeply in it,
And anecdotally, it's a qualitative rather than quantitative sample, just in terms of in my neighbors and community and friends.
What do you find?
Well, I mean, generationally, and I can't say that I really thought, I would say these are issues that I would avoid rather than embrace in discussion with friends and neighbors. However, these are all kind. And I mean, I'm sure that there are police officers who aren't great within the department, but the people that I know, I mean, these are kind people who work in their communities, who help their communities, who volunteer in sports and everything, and deeply professional people who I can I have a tough time imagining not, behaving anything other than professionally. However, that's not, it's not the context I'm experiencing their interaction. But in terms on generationally, I don't get the impression that, let's say, there's a tougher edge to the older generation than to the younger. I think these are sort of personalities, different.
Well, and these older guys, remember, came up
totally anecdotally,
but they came up as reform was happening.
Yeah, they
So
experienced
they were trained in that respect. Many of them are college graduates. I mean, many of them went to Northeastern. It's just so radically different from what we had before. Not that their predecessors were bad guys.
Yeah.
And they were all guys.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's just they're products of this new approach to policing.
Yeah.
Even the older folks.
Yeah.
And it's made a huge difference. It's made a huge difference.
Yeah. So I want to give Gabe a chance to ask a question because he's asked if he could ask you a question directly.
Go ahead. Gabe, where are you?
Hey, Governor Dukakis, thank you for coming in. My question is just, why do you think in these big cities like LA or Chicago or New York, we've seen such a lack of mutual respect, as you've been talking about, between the citizens and the police? Like, I think what we saw over the summer was clearly a lack of mutual respect on both sides.
I don't know why in various places. Kenosha, Wisconsin. Why would Kenosha, Wisconsin be a place that had tough police attitudes, that wasn't sensitive to this, that hadn't evolved as I would argue Boston has evolved in other communities? I don't know. Is it individual? Is it leadership in the particular community? By the way, I haven't mentioned this, and I should have. Boston has had a series of damn good mayors over the course of my professional lifetime, starting with Tom Menino and coming on down, and including Marty Walsh.
Wasn't Tom Menino Boston's first mayor? It seemed like he was mayor for so long.
Kevin White was the first of the long serving.
What was it? 5 terms for Menino, something like that.
It was at least 4, maybe it was 5. But for one thing, they stuck around for a while. We haven't had a kind of revolving door. And secondly, almost without exception, they bought into the kind of police community relationship that we've been talking about for the last hour, and believed in it. And Marty does too. That's important, folks, to have that kind of leadership over an extended period of time, going back to the late 60s when White was first elected. Makes a huge difference. Menino was a damn good mayor and a good person. And he took this issue very seriously. So there's a lot of that has to do with mayoral leadership, as well as all of the other things that we've been talking about. Put them all together and you get results.
What's nice about you, Governor Dukakis, is you're very generous about sharing credit. It's a great quality.
Remember, the governor doesn't run the police department in Boston. Yeah. The governor may have something to do with overall policy generally, and obviously has something to do with the state police, which has its own problems these days, as we all know, Simon, for reasons I don't understand, and why they continue is beyond me. But a lot of this involves leadership at the municipal level, with support, if possible, from whoever the governor is. But it's these mayors with whom I worked very closely, and with whom I think it's fair to say I developed very good relationships, because I think one of the things a governor has to do is work on that relationship, particularly with municipal leaders, both in Boston and outside of Boston. Now, don't ask me why we still seem to have a problem in Springfield when it comes to policing. I don't understand that. It's a good city. It's got good leadership. I don't know what's going on out there. So it's not as if we're exempt from this kind of thing. But overall, we've made great progress, and again, sorry to be repetitive about this. I think the fact that our institutions of higher education, led by Northeastern, but now including other colleges and universities in the state, have really stepped up and taken their role and responsibility seriously, and it's made a great difference. Made a great difference.
So I think we only have time for one more question. So I'm going to combine a couple and then add a twist of my own. So Priya asked about the question of systemic racism and whether that, whether that plays a role in policing, and if that's something that it's a big question of whether it can be rectified in the country, but maybe start with whether it can be rectified in policing. And Nabila asks essentially about the power gap and the between civilians and police, which I think ties into this question about how minorities experience policing, and whether this contributes to, I suppose, this last lack of trust or mutual respect. And my twist on these questions, which are essentially about the problems in the way minorities experience the police, and the continuing problems with race in the country, is, where are we going? How do you see the future? Do you see it getting better, maybe, or worse?
Oh, well, look,
and that we'll end it with that. That's so you can.
The short answer is that I've seen so much progress during my lifetime when it comes to this that there's no comparison, but it's nowhere near where it must be.
Mm.
And this has got to be a continuing responsibility for all of us who care deeply about our communities, about our country. Just no question about it. And some of the stuff that we've seen this past summer is continues to be troubling. But in terms of progress made, I mean, Lord, it just, and not just when it comes to policing as such, but residential segregation, all of this kind of stuff has made, I've seen such change for the better.
Yeah.
But it's not enough. We've still got a lot to do. And frankly, you guys who I'm looking at, talking to, have a major responsibility to get into public service, to develop good consensus building skills, to be able to do the kinds of things that bring people together, and that continue to improve the situation steadily and effectively, because we're still not where we ought to be.
Well, that is a perfect place to end. And folks, it's all on you is the answer. So take up the torch that Governor Dukakis is handing to you. Jonah, is your connection, is it a really quick one?
Yep. So Governor Dukakis, my dad actually worked under your wife Kitty's campaign for the press secretary, Andrew Savitz. My dad is best friends with Andrew Savitz's younger brother, John. So I thought that was a cool connection.
Well, Andy was a wonderful guy, just a wonderful guy.
Thanks for that, Jonah. And that is perfect. I'm going to have to let the students go, but not before I tell them the trivia question for the mug battle for this beauty right here. What recipe is Governor Dukakis most famous for? That is the question. You can email me your answers. You get it? I'll post it on Canvas. Thank you so much, Governor Dukakis. Mike, it's been an absolute pleasure. And the students really, I mean, I know that they benefited tremendously from you joining us.
And think seriously about public service as a career, folks. There's nothing like it.
Absolutely.
Nothing like it. And the fact that you're at Northeastern and have an opportunity to combine co-op and And public service is a terrific thing. So take it seriously. We need you guys.
Yeah, whatever
Thank
your
you.
politics are, get involved and make a difference.
You bet.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Take care.
Thanks,
Have a great
Simon.
day.
Thank you all. Enjoy. Nice to see you. You bet. Okay.